He was safe. That's the part nobody could understand. He had survived 2 tours, 14 months of combat. Things that would make most people collapse just hearing about them. He had come home to a house, a wife, and 2 kids, who ran to the door when they heard his car. He was safe, he was loved, he was home. And every morning, he woke up wishing he was back. Not back to the fear or the loss or the violence, back to the feeling, the aliveness, the sense, sharper than anything he had felt before or since, that he mattered, that the person beside him needed him, that what he did each day was the most important thing in the world. He told his therapist, "I know it's wrong. I know I'm not supposed to feel this way, but nothing here has ever felt that real." His therapist had heard this before. She hears it constantly, and almost no veteran is willing to say it out loud. If you've been following this series, you already know something most people never sit with. You know that ordinary people become capable of extraordinary violence under the right conditions. You know that the brain rewires itself under sustained stress. You know that the soldier who comes home is not the same person who left, and that the gap between who they were and who they became can be lethal. But there is a dimension of this story we haven't touched yet. One that makes people deeply uncomfortable, one that veterans rarely admit to their families, their doctors, or themselves. It is this. Some of them miss it. Not the killing, not the terror, not the friends they lost. They miss the war itself. The structure of it, the purpose, the intensity, the feeling of being completely, absolutely alive, in a way that peacetime simply cannot replicate. This is not a fringe experience. Research suggests it is one of the most common and most suppressed psychological realities of the returning soldier. And understanding it changes everything. About how we think about war, about veterans, and about the society they come home to. Because the question isn't just, why do soldiers miss the war? The deeper question is, what does it say about peace? Sebastian Junger had already seen war up close. He had spent 15 months embedded with a US Army platoon in one of the most dangerous valleys in Afghanistan, the Korangal. He had watched men fight, bleed, grieve, and hold each other in the dark. He noticed something. The men who had survived the Korangal kept going back. Not physically, but mentally. Junger's thesis in his book Tribe was simple. The things that make war psychologically unbearable are also the things that make it psychologically necessary for the human soul. And modern peacetime society provides almost none of them. In September 1940, during the London Blitz, the government expected mass psychological breakdown. Instead, the opposite happened. Rates of depression plummeted, suicide rates dropped. The shared purpose and collective identity created a resilience that modern life lacks. To understand why war can feel more alive than peace, you have to understand what the brain does under extreme conditions. When in danger, the brain shifts into a mode of extraordinary clarity. The senses sharpen. Coming home is not a return to normal. It is a descent into flatness. The food doesn't taste as sharp, colors seem duller, conversations feel weightless. This is not dysfunction. It is the brain doing exactly what brains do, comparing the present to its established baseline, and finding the present inadequate. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. When that intensity disappears, ordinary life doesn't just feel less exciting, it feels unreal. The tribe they left behind. But the neurochemistry is only half the story. There is something else soldiers miss that is harder to name and harder to replace. The unit. In combat, the bonds between soldiers are forged at a depth that civilian relationships almost never reach. Not because soldiers are better people, or more loving, or more capable of connection, but because the conditions of war create a form of intimacy that peacetime simply does not generate. When your life depends on the person beside you, something happens in the brain that is chemically and neurologically distinct from ordinary friendship. The threat response and the attachment system activate simultaneously, fusing together in a way that produces bonds of extraordinary intensity and durability. Soldiers know things about each other that spouses don't know. They have seen each other at the absolute extreme of human experience. Terrified, exhausted, broken, heroic. They have held each other in the dark after friends died. They have made decisions together that no one outside the unit will ever fully understand. This is what Younger means by tribe, not the military as an institution, the platoon, the squad, the 6 or 8 or 12 people who became, in the most literal sense, the reason you were still alive. And then it ends. The deployment is over. The unit disperses. Everyone goes home to their separate lives, their separate cities, their separate families, and the soldier is left trying to explain to a spouse or a parent or a friend what it feels like to have lost something that he cannot name, for a relationship that he cannot describe, for a world that no longer exists. Most of them don't try. Because most of them know, before they open their mouths, that the person across the table has no framework for what they're about to hear. What Durkheim knew a century ago. In 1897, the French sociologist Émile Durkheim published a landmark study on suicide. His central finding was counterintuitive and, at the time, deeply controversial. Suicide rates, Durkheim found, were not simply a function of individual misery. They were a function of social integration. People who were deeply embedded in communities, who had clear roles, shared purposes, and strong social bonds, were dramatically less likely to die by suicide, regardless of their personal circumstances. And here was the part that shocked people. During periods of collective crisis, wars, natural disasters, economic collapses, suicide rates consistently dropped. Not because people were happier, but because crisis creates exactly the conditions of integration that peacetime often lacks. Shared danger, common purpose, the dissolution of the self into something larger. Durkheim called this social cohesion. We might call it, more simply, the feeling of mattering. The data from World War I confirmed his theory dramatically. As the war began and millions of men were mobilized, suicide rates across Europe plummeted. The effect was documented in Britain, France, Germany, and Austria, on both sides of the conflict simultaneously. The same pattern appeared in World War II, in the Falklands War, in the weeks after the September 11th attacks in America. Every time a society faces a collective threat, something happens to its members. The isolation dissolves. The trivial falls away. People need each other again, in the most fundamental sense. And for a brief, terrible, clarifying moment, they feel alive. Karl Marlantes and the confession that cost him. Karl Marlantes is a decorated Vietnam veteran, a Rhodes Scholar, and the author of what many consider the finest novel about the Vietnam War ever written. He spent 30 years after the war unable to talk about what he had experienced. Not the violence, not the trauma. The part he couldn't talk about was the part he loved. In his memoir, What It Is Like to Go to War, Marlantes wrote with a candor that made many readers deeply uncomfortable. He described the experience of combat at its most intense as something close to ecstasy. A state of total presence, total aliveness, total connection to the people beside him, that he had never found anywhere else in his life. He was not celebrating war. He was describing what it actually felt like from inside, and refusing to pretend that it was only horror. I loved it, he wrote, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to make sense of what that means about me, about war, about all of us. That sentence is the one that most people, veterans and civilians alike, cannot sit with. Because if it is true for Marlantes, a thoughtful, educated, morally serious person who spent decades examining his own experience, then it raises a question that has no comfortable answer. What does it mean that the most intense experience of aliveness many humans will ever feel is the experience of war? What does that tell us about the lives we have built in its absence? The data behind the silence. Researchers who study veteran reintegration have documented the phenomenon Marlantes described with clinical precision. A 2014 study published in the journal Clinical Psychological Science found that veterans who reported missing the camaraderie and intensity of combat showed significantly higher rates of reintegration difficulty. Not because they were unstable, but because the gap between what they had experienced and what civilian life offered was simply wider. Jonathan Shea, whose work we explored in the last video, described the phenomenon in terms of what he called the berserk state, the neurological condition of combat at its most extreme. and the profound disorientation that follows its withdrawal. The brain that has lived in that state doesn't simply return to baseline. It mourns the state. It searches for it. It finds ordinary life not just less exciting but actively aversive, like going from full color to black and white and being told this is better. Surveys of veterans consistently find that significant percentages, in some studies majorities, report that their time in service was the most meaningful period of their lives, not despite the hardship. Because of it. Because hardship, shared with people who depend on you, is one of the few reliable generators of meaning that human beings have ever found. And peacetime, in the modern world, is remarkably efficient at eliminating hardship without replacing the meaning it carried. The adrenaline that never fully leaves. There is a biological dimension to this that most conversations about veterans ignore. When the brain operates at sustained high intensity, the kind that combat produces, it does not simply return to its previous state when the intensity ends. The neurochemical systems that were activated repeatedly and powerfully leave traces. Researchers studying addiction have found that the brain's reward circuitry responds to adrenaline and extreme stress in ways that parallel its response to certain drugs. The system habituates, it builds tolerance, it begins to require higher and higher levels of stimulation to produce the same sense of aliveness. This is not a moral failure. It is biology. But it means that the veteran who comes home and finds civilian life flat is not simply being dramatic or ungrateful. His brain has been calibrated, through months of sustained extreme experience, to a level of stimulation that the ordinary world cannot provide. Some veterans describe it as spending the rest of their lives chasing a feeling they can never quite catch again. Others describe it as living in two time zones simultaneously. One foot in the present, the kitchen, the children, the job, and one foot permanently anchored in a place that no longer exists. This duality is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to communicate to someone who has not experienced it. Because from the outside, the veteran has everything. He is home, he is safe, he is loved. And from the inside, something essential is missing. Something that was so present, so consuming, so real, that its absence feels like a kind of amputation. You can see the missing limb in the space where it used to be. But you cannot explain it to someone who has never had that limb. Why they don't talk about it. Here is the reason most veterans will never say any of this out loud. Because the culture surrounding veterans in America has built a very specific narrative. And that narrative has no room for what we are describing here. The narrative goes like this. Soldiers go to war, they suffer, they come home damaged. They need our help and our gratitude. This narrative is not wrong, but it is incomplete. And its incompleteness creates a particular kind of silence. Because within that narrative, the only permissible relationship a veteran is supposed to have with their service is one of damage and survival. The war was bad. Coming home was the good part. The healing is the story. A veteran who says that part of them misses it, that part of them felt more alive in a combat zone than they have felt since, that part of them would go back if they could, is saying something that the narrative cannot accommodate. The people around them hear it as glorifying violence, or as ingratitude for the life they have, or as most painfully, as a rejection of the family and the home and the love that waited for them. None of those interpretations are accurate, but they are the ones that rush in to fill the space when the truth is too complicated to hold. And so veterans learn to be quiet about this particular thing. They talk about the horror. The horror is legible. The horror fits the narrative. The horror gets nods and sympathy and understanding. The part that they loved, the part that still pulls at them, even years later, even in the middle of ordinary happiness, that part gets swallowed. And swallowed things have a way of finding other exits. The society that forgot how to need people. Here is where this becomes about more than veterans. The loneliness epidemic in America is well documented. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy declared it a public health crisis. Studies find that Americans report having fewer close friends than at any point in recorded survey history. A significant percentage report having no one they would describe as a close friend at all. This is not a coincidence that exists alongside the veteran crisis. It is the same crisis, seen from different angles. The veteran who comes home from the intense interdependence of the combat unit is re-entering a society that has been systematically dismantling the structures of interdependence for decades. The civic organizations, the neighborhood communities, the religious institutions, the union halls, all the places where people used to need each other, in ways that generated the bonds veterans had in the field, have been quietly disappearing. What replaced them is a culture of individualism so complete that needing other people has begun to feel like a personal failure. The veteran who misses the war is not missing the violence. He is missing the only period in his life when it was obvious, unmistakable, undeniable, that he was needed. That his presence changed outcomes. That the person beside him would not be alive without him, in a grocery store, in a traffic jam, in a cubicle. No one needs you like that. No one will die if you don't show up. The stakes are low, the connections are thin, the meaning is optional. For a brain that has been calibrated to high stakes, thick connection, and non-optional meaning, this is not relief. It is deprivation. The question nobody wants to answer. There is a veteran, we'll call him Daniel, who did 3 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He came home the last time at 34 years old, healthy, decorated, intact in every way that showed. His wife had waited. His kids had grown. His parents had aged. He sat at his kitchen table on his first morning home and looked at the coffee in front of him and felt nothing. Not relief, not joy, not grief, nothing. It was like the volume had been turned off, he said, and I didn't know if it was ever going to come back on. He found a therapist eventually. He found a veterans group. He found, slowly and imperfectly, some version of a life that didn't feel like a pale imitation of the one he had left behind. But he told his therapist something that he has never told his wife. He told her that even now, a decade later, there are mornings when he wakes up, and the first thing his brain does, before the coffee, before the children, before anything, is reach back for that feeling. The feeling of absolute aliveness, the feeling of mattering completely, the feeling that was so total, so consuming, so real, that everything since has been in some quiet and unspoken way a little less. He is not celebrating war. He is not asking to go back. He is describing what it actually cost him, what it costs many of them. Not just the horror, the loss of something he cannot name to someone he cannot explain it to, in a world that has no place for what he is trying to say. What happens when there is no answer? There is a question that a researcher named Dave Grossman was once asked at a lecture. The question came from a Vietnam veteran in the audience. He was in his 60s. He had been home for 40 years. He said, "I've done everything right. I got the therapy. I built the life. I love my family. By every measure, I'm okay. But I need you to tell me, is it normal that I still think about it every single day?" Grossman paused for a long time before answering. He said, "Yes, and I'm sorry that no one told you sooner." The room went very quiet, because what that veteran was describing, the daily return of the mind to a place that no longer exists, a time that is over, an intensity that cannot be recovered, is not a symptom to be treated. It is a testament to how completely, how totally, how permanently that experience became part of who he was. You do not spend 40 years thinking every day about something that didn't matter. The fact that it stays, that it refuses to be integrated into the past, the way other memories are integrated, is the brain's way of marking it as significant beyond the ordinary scale. Something happened there that nothing before or since has equaled, and the brain, faithful and relentless, keeps returning to it, the way a tongue returns to the space where a tooth used to be, not because it wants to go back, because it cannot forget what it was like to be whole. This is the secret that no veteran will tell you at a dinner party, or a homecoming, or a Veterans Day ceremony. It is the thing that sits behind the polished answers and the careful smiles and the "I'm fine, really, I'm good." The war made me feel more alive than anything else ever has. And I don't know what to do with that. And I'm not sure I'm allowed to say it, but it is true, and it will always be true. And all the therapy and all the medication and all the love in the world has not made it less true. That is the darkest secret. And now you know it. What we still don't understand. We have spent 5 videos examining what war does to the people who fight it. We have looked at the neuroscience, the psychology, The statistics, the individual stories, and the picture that emerges is more complicated than the one most people carry. War is not just horror, it is also meaning. It is not just destruction. It is also, paradoxically, the most alive many people will ever feel. And the society that sends people to war, the society that benefits from what they do, that hangs the yellow ribbons and prints the bumper stickers and calls them heroes, has built almost nothing to replace what it asked them to give up. Not the years, not the health, not the friends they lost, the feeling, the tribe. The terrible, irreplaceable aliveness of being needed by someone who would die without you. Younger ends Tribe with a question that I have been sitting with since I first read it. He asks, what would it take to build a society that gave people, all people, not just soldiers, the sense of belonging and purpose and mutual need that war provides? What would we have to give up? What would we have to build? What would we have to become? He does not answer the question, because it doesn't have an easy answer. But it might be the most important question of our time. Because if the only place a person can feel truly needed, truly alive, truly part of something larger than themselves, is a war zone, then the problem isn't the soldiers who miss the war. The problem is everything they came home to. Before you go, if you are a veteran watching this, or if you love one, I want to say something directly. Missing the war does not make you broken. It does not make you broken. It does not make you dangerous. It does not mean you want to go back to the violence. It means you experienced something at a depth that the world around you was not designed to match. That is not your failure. It is a failure of imagination, collective, societal, structural, that we have not figured out how to offer people what war offers without the war. That is the conversation this series has been building toward, and we are not finished. Tell me in the comments, do you think it is possible to build a peacetime society that gives people genuine belonging, genuine purpose, genuine stakes? Or is that something that only crisis can create? I want to know what you think. Not what you're supposed to think, what you actually think when you sit with the question. Because the answer matters, not just for veterans, for all of us. If this series has been doing something for you, if these videos have been opening something you didn't have language for before, subscribe and share this one. Not for the algorithm, because this conversation deserves more people in the room. Video 7 is coming. We've spent 6 videos inside the soldier's mind. Next, we step back further, to the people who were never soldiers, the families, the children, the ones who waited. What does war do to the people who never went, but lived inside the shadow of someone who did? That story is next. Don't miss it.